Pope Francis will wash the feet of 12 inmates at Rome's Central Prison tomorrow. The ritual at the prison dates back to Francis's first Holy Thursday as Pope 5 years ago. It led to backlash from conservatives because women and Muslims were included. It's one of many actions by Francis that have raised concerns among conservative Catholics.
Dozens of theologians, priests, and academics accused the Pope of spreading heresy when his 2016 document called The Joy of Love. Critics panned his opinions on marriage, moral life, and the sacraments. New York Times' Ross Douthat delves into the controversy over that document and its impact in his new book, To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. It's published by Simon & Schuster of Division of CBS. Ross Douthat, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You've been very critical of Pope Francis, specifically his decision to give communion to divorced or remarried couples. Why?
Because I think it risks, ultimately, aspects of Catholicism that are essential to the Church's claim to be the one true Church that connects itself all the way back to Jesus himself. One of the things that is most interesting in certain ways about Catholicism is the way that for all of its worldly pomps and, all of its popes getting in wars and, and being worldly and causing trouble, it's also the place where you find some of the strongest words of Jesus still lived out. So Jesus says, you must eat my body and drink my blood. And the Catholic Church still says, in communion, that's exactly what you do. And in the same way, the Church is the last institution really in the Western world that makes any kind of claim that Christian marriage is indissoluble.
Well, why punish people who get divorced? I mean, specifically, why punish them and not allow them to have communion?
Because the Church thinks that you aren't, well, first of all, you aren't punished by not being allowed to take communion if you're divorced. The Church doesn't exclude. The Church doesn't exclude people who are divorced from communion. It excludes people who are remarried without having an annulment of their first marriage. And look, these are. I mean, my parents and grandparents are both divorced. Like most people in our society, I live in a world where families are broken, family structures are complicated, and so on. And I wouldn't want to live in the world where the Church was, running marriage tribunals for everyone and sort of imposing its rules in civil law. But what the Church says now is, in this culture where divorce is common and remarriage is rampant, we're going to say that, that second marriages, if you can't get an annulment, and by the way, before Francis came along, annulment rules were already, especially in the U.S., fairly merciful. So what you have under Francis is just a step towards a kind of, the Church's teaching becomes potentially, and look, this hasn't fully happened yet.
Let's talk more about Pope Francis generally.
Yeah, because we should say you became a Catholic when you were a teenager, and you're very happy about that decision. But you talk about the Pope, you say he's the most powerful person in the Church, but what are his powers really?
Right, and
is he bringing people back? You call him a media phenomenon, but is he bringing lapsed people back into the Church?
Right, and in addition to being a Catholic, I'm a journalist, as punishment for my sins, I guess. And the reality is, even if you think that I'm, too harsh and unforgiving on the question of divorce and remarriage, I think the underlying story here that I try and tell in the book is just a fascinating one, because the Church is, you're right, he's the most powerful man in the Church. He's an absolute monarch in certain ways, and yet his powers are supposed to be tightly circumscribed. Because he's not supposed to change essential things that his predecessors have taught going all the way back 2,000 years. So a lot of the drama of the Francis pontificate that you guys alluded to at the start, bishops and theologians arguing with each other, cardinals challenging the Pope and so on, reflects what happens, this fascinating thing, when a Pope sets out to sort of push the limits of his office.
And you say Rome under Francis is much like Washington under Trump, a paranoid, jumpy place. They're both populists, in effect.
In effect, yeah. And I want to be clear. I'm not drawing any kind of moral comparison between the Holy Father and President Trump. The comparison is more of their role within their respective institutions. Both of them have entered institutions, the U.S. government and the Church of Rome, that have major credibility problems, that are sort of creaking and straining under the pressures of modernity. And they both have sort of factions that see them as, making America great again, making Catholicism great again, if you will.
Yeah.
And a lot of the tensions, a lot of the institutional tensions are similar, even as again, they're very different figures personally, but they both, I think, speak to this moment in the West generally, where there's this sense that all of our institutions, governmental, religious, and so on, aren't working particularly well, and so there are openings for populists, for reformers. The question is just whether those reforms actually deliver what they're trying to promise.
You've raised a lot of interesting questions in the book. Thank you very much, Ross, for coming to the table
Thank you so much for having me.
To Change the Church is on sale now wherever you like to buy your books.